So, welcome everybody. Welcome to this lecture in International Monetary Economics. We are in Chapter 18, and Chapter 18 deals with fixed exchange rate systems. In fixed exchange rate systems, it is the case that the central bank is responsible for keeping the exchange rate fixed, and therefore, in case that there are some appreciation or depreciation pressures, it will be the case that the central bank has to intervene at the foreign exchange market in order to keep the exchange rate fixed. Once more, we can have a look at our list how to set up a model. First step, we have to define the equilibrium conditions. We have to derive the slope of the curves and determine the equilibrium. Afterwards, we can start to identify the shock. It's always an exogenous variable which changes in the beginning. We need to know which curve shifts in which directions, and we find the answers in the equations. We have to perform a graphical analysis in step number 6. So we are shifting the curves and we are determining the new equilibrium. In the end, we confirm the graphical results by computing multipliers, and we compare the graphical results and the formal results. To some extent, this is different in Chapter 18 because of the fact that we have already defined the equilibrium conditions in one of the previous chapters. So it makes sense to have a brief look at it, but we don't have to go into detail. When you look at equation 1, you know that we are in the ISZZ LMZZ model. So we are looking at one economy which is not capacity constrained. So we are looking at one economy which has a tremendous unemployment problem right now. Unemployment rates are very high, 25%. And it is the case that in the bakery we are looking at, there are 100 ovens, but only 75 ovens are running. 25% of the capacity is lying idle. We are not using the full capital stock, and we are not using the full labor force because of the fact that we are in a recession. So right now, the economy we are looking at is at a recession, has an unemployment problem, and therefore it is so important to know whether an expansionary monetary or an expansionary fiscal policy helps to cure the problem of this economy. Equation 1 is the goods market equilibrium condition. Nothing has changed compared to the situation where we were analyzing a floating exchange rate system. So everything is in line with our previous chapter. When you look at equation 2, the money market equilibrium condition, then also nothing has changed on the right-hand side. Money demand depends on the autonomous component of money demand, D0, then one component which depends on GDP, the money demand from the transaction motive, and then also the opportunity cost of holding money plays a role. Money demand is negatively related to the interest rate. On the left-hand side of this equation, we have real money supply, and the special element, like the new element in this chapter, is that nominal money supply consists out of two components. One component is the home component, the domestic component. The home component of money demand changes in case that the central bank is buying or selling domestic bonds at the domestic bond market. So in case that the central bank is, for example, printing new money, is walking over to the domestic bond market and is buying domestic bonds, then the central bank is paying with freshly printed notes so that money supply in circulation increases. Then when the central bank uses the domestic bond market to increase money supply, we will address the H variable. The foreign component of money supply will change in case that the central bank intervenes at the foreign exchange market. Let's assume that the central bank also prints some domestic money, prints domestic notes, walks over to the foreign exchange market, and the central bank is buying foreign currency. Afterwards, the central banker goes back to the central bank and stores the foreign currency in the cellar of the central bank. In case that the central bank intervenes in this respect, then the foreign component of money supply increases, F increases, because the central bank is buying foreign currency by printing new domestic currency and is paying for the foreign currency by freshly printed domestic currency. So domestic currency in circulation increases, the F component increases. So the F component is very important in a fixed exchange rate system because there it might be the case that the exchange rate gets under pressure and then the central bank intervenes by increasing or decreasing the foreign component of money supply. The third equilibrium condition is that the domestic interest rate has to be equal to the foreign interest rate. So we are looking at a small open economy which has complete capital mobility in place, and therefore the domestic interest rate cannot depart from the foreign interest rate. R has to be equal to R star. On the next few slides, you can once more have a look at the parameters. It is very important that you are able to distinguish parameters, exogenous and endogenous variables. This is very important when it comes to the more formal analysis where we compute multipliers, because we always assume that the parameters are constant, the parameters do not change. With respect to the endogenous variables, it is the case that the domestic GDP level is endogenous, the domestic interest rate is endogenous, and F, the foreign component of money supply, is an endogenous variable in a fixed exchange rate system. This is the case because of the fact that the central bank has to intervene to defend the exchange rate in case that there is appreciation or depreciation pressure. The exogenous variables are the nominal exchange rate is exogenous in a fixed exchange rate system. At some point in time, the central bank or the government has fixed the nominal exchange rate. This nominal exchange rate does not change, and therefore it's an exogenous variable. Like all the other variables listed here are also exogenous, especially like the foreign variables are exogenous. The foreign interest rate, the foreign price level are exogenous variables. Also, like the foreign GDP level is exogenous, Y star is an exogenous variable. This is missing here on the list. I will add that. Furthermore, highlighted in red ink, the domestic component of money supply, H, is also an exogenous variable. It is very important to know which variable is endogenous, which variable is exogenous when we perform a more formal analysis, because there at some point in time we have to sort the endogenous variables on the left-hand side and the exogenous variables on the right-hand side. For this step, it is very important to know which variables are endogenous, which ones are exogenous. We don't have to derive the slope of the two curves because of the fact that we did that already in chapter 17. Nothing has changed in this respect, so the LMZZ curve is a vertical line while the ISZZ curve is upward sloping. So we are working in a diagram where we are putting the exchange rate on the vertical axis and the GDP level on the horizontal axis. In the intersection of the LMZZ curve and the ISZZ curve, we find our first equilibrium. So scenario A defines the first equilibrium. And one difference is that now we are using a small index fix here to indicate that this exchange rate level is fixed. In the first step, we want to perform an expansionary monetary policy, and we want to find out how this shock is digested. We proceed as follows. In the first step, we are analyzing how would this shock be digested in case that we would live in a floating exchange rate world. From this intermediate step, we know whether there is appreciation pressure or depreciation pressure for the domestic currency. We know whether the exchange rate decreases or increases, or to be very precise, we need to know whether there is some pressure that the exchange rate increases or decreases. Let's perform this first step. The central bank performs an expansionary monetary policy in the following form: that the central bank is printing new domestic money notes, is walking over to the domestic bond market, is buying domestic bonds, and thereby the H component of money supply increases. The H component increases and the LMZZ curve shifts to the right. In a floating exchange rate system, this shock would be digested in the following way. The exchange rate increases, which is a depreciation of the domestic currency, and the GDP level increases, the economy is able to get out of recession. So monetary policy works fine in this setting. Monetary policy works fine in case that we live in a floating exchange rate world. But here we have to be to some extent careful because of the fact that in chapter 18 we deal with a fixed exchange rate system. Therefore, we have to interpret this scenario B in the following way: that there is some depreciation pressure on the foreign exchange market. There is some pressure that the exchange rate increases, and the central bank is forced to intervene at the foreign exchange market to defend the fixed exchange rate level EA. So in scenario B, there is some pressure that the domestic currency is the weak currency and the foreign currency is a strong currency. Therefore, the central bank has to go into the cellar and has to get foreign currency, foreign reserves out of the cellar, is walking over to the foreign exchange market. The central bank is selling foreign currency and is buying domestic currency. The central bank is selling foreign currency because of the fact that the foreign currency is a strong currency, and the central bank is buying domestic currency because there is a tendency that the domestic currency is weak. Hence, in the end, the central bank is selling foreign currency and is demanding domestic currency so that domestic currency in circulation decreases. The central bank is losing reserves, the foreign component of money supply decreases, and therefore the LM curve shifts back to the left. In the end, it is the case that the exchange rate in scenario C is equal to the fixed exchange rate EA. So the exchange rate indeed is fixed, but it's also the case that the GDP level has not changed when we compare scenario A and scenario C. Hence, we can conclude that the central bank is not able to perform an expansionary monetary policy, monetary policy does not help to increase output and to cure the unemployment problem. In the next step, we want to perform a more formal analysis, and we want to confirm the graphical results by computing multipliers. So in a first step, we have to transform these two equations in matrix notation, and we have to write the variables in, or we have to sort the variables in a way that the endogenous variables go to the left-hand side and the exogenous variables go to the right-hand side. In the first step, we perform the assumption that P star and P are normalized to 1. And then it will be the case that, of course, the real exchange rate term in the first equation will look much smaller. So it is the case that we say P is equal to 1, P star is equal to 1. So we end up with nx3e on the right-hand side. Furthermore, also, we are normalizing this P here to 1, so that P disappears from the left-hand side of the money market equilibrium condition. We sort the variables in a way that we sort the endogenous variables on the left-hand side, the exogenous ones on the right-hand side. Endogenous is y and f. So we have to collect the y variables on the left-hand side. There is one y variable already here, and there is a plus c1y on the right-hand side. When we put it to the left-hand side, we get a minus c1y on the left-hand side. Furthermore, there is a minus nx1y on the right-hand side. When we put this one on the left-hand side, we get a plus nx1y on the left-hand side. The goods market equilibrium condition does not depend on F, so we have nothing on the second position. With respect to the money market equilibrium condition, we have a D1Y on the right-hand side. In case that we put this F here on the right-hand side, we get a minus F on the right-hand side. So we have a positive D1Y minus F. And then we put the D0 on the other hand side, pops up with a negative sign, and we put minus D2R star on the other hand side, pops up with a positive sign. Now we can write this relationship in matrix notation. So we are collecting the endogenous variables in this vector of the two unknowns, and we collect all the exogenous variables in the solution vector. We collect all the coefficients in the coefficient matrix. Due to the fact that the goods market equilibrium condition does not depend on F, we have here the coefficient 0, which is related to the goods market equilibrium condition and the variable F. Afterwards, we take the total differential. We take the total differential and write a D in front of each variable. This is the important step where we assume that the parameters are constant. The parameters do not change. Therefore, we write no D in front of the parameter, but only in front of the variable. This is, for example, important when we compute the total differential with respect to minus C1t. We write the D in front of the variable t and not in front of the parameter C1. So we are in the position to compute the first multiplier. So we can compute the income multiplier of an expansionary monetary policy in a fixed exchange rate system. So the central bank is increasing the domestic component of money supply, and we want to find out how is the GDP reacting, how does the GDP change in case that the central bank changes the domestic component of money supply. The y variable is located on the first position. Therefore, Cramer's rule tells you take the solution vector and insert this element in the first position of the coefficient matrix. And then we have to compute the determinant of the changed coefficient matrix and divide it by the determinant of the unchanged coefficient matrix. So let's compute the determinant 0 times minus 1 minus dh times 0. And then in the denominator 1 minus c1 plus nx1 times minus 1 minus d1 times 0. When we put this dh on the other hand side of the equation, we get dy over dh is equal to 0. Therefore, the formal analysis confirms the graphical result. An expansionary monetary policy does not affect the GDP level. In the next step, we can also compute the reserve multiplier of an expansionary monetary policy in a fixed exchange rate system. And we are assuming here that df/dh has to be equal to minus 1. So in case that the central bank is trying to increase the domestic component of money supply, the central bank is losing reserves on a 101 basis, so that in the end, when the central bank increases money supply by the domestic component and loses the foreign reserves, money supply in the end will be constant. Let's do our computations. The reserve component is on the second position. Therefore, we take the solution vector and insert these elements into the second column of the coefficient matrix. And we have to compute the multiplier. So 1 minus c1 plus nx1 times dh minus d1 times 0. In the denominator, 1 minus c1 plus nx1 times minus 1 minus d1 times 0. There are some zeros here, so these zeros, they do not pop up anymore. There is a negative sign here, so this negative sign goes to the front. And we can also put this dh on the other hand side of the equation. So we get 1 minus c1 plus nx1 in the numerator, and in the denominator minus 1 minus c1 plus nx1 in brackets. So this term 1 minus c1 plus nx1 cancels out, and we get the information that df over dh is equal to minus 1. So the central bank is losing reserves on a 101 basis. In case that the central bank increases the domestic component of money supply, H, by 100 units, then the central bank is losing 100 units of reserves. And therefore, in the end, money supply does not change. The conclusions. In a fixed exchange rate system, an increase of the domestic component of money supply leads to a decrease of the reserve component on a 101 basis. The central bank is not able to influence the level of money supply, and therefore monetary policy is ineffective in influencing the GDP level and thereby the unemployment rate. In a fixed exchange rate system, monetary policy does not work. Let's check whether fiscal policy is an option. Once more, we are in the initial equilibrium. In scenario A, the exchange rate is fixed. And in the first step, we want to find out how is this shock digested in a floating exchange rate system so that we know what kind of tendency exists on the foreign exchange market, whether there is appreciation or depreciation pressure for the domestic currency. When the government increases government spending, the IS curve shifts to the right. And therefore, it is the case that in the new equilibrium, in a floating exchange rate system, we would observe the exchange rate to decrease while the GDP level is constant. The IS curve shifts to the right. The exchange rate decreases, which is an appreciation of the domestic currency. We called this kind of effect an exchange rate induced crowding out effect because the government is crowding out the foreigners. In a fixed exchange rate system, we have to modify our analysis a little bit. We have to argue that this increase in government spending just leads to a tendency that the exchange rate decreases. So it leads to some appreciation pressures. In scenario B, there is a tendency that the domestic currency is strong and the foreign currency is weak. Therefore, the central bank has to intervene at the foreign exchange market. The central bank has to print new domestic currency, has to walk over to the foreign exchange market and has to demand the currency which is weak. The central bank has to demand foreign currency and pays with freshly printed domestic currency notes. Therefore, domestic currency in circulation increases and the reserve component of money supply increases. The reserve component increases. This leads to a shift of the LMZZ curve to the right, and we have to shift the LMZZ curve in a way that in the end the exchange rate is fixed on the level EA. So let's shift the LMZZ curve to the right. In this graph, the exchange rate is indeed fixed at the level EA, and we can see the effects on GDP. GDP increases. So this exchange rate induced crowding out effect, which is present in a floating exchange rate system, does not pop up because the exchange rate is fixed. And hence, the effect of an expansionary fiscal policy on GDP is still there. An expansionary fiscal policy is able to affect the output variable, and hence an expansionary fiscal policy is an option to increase GDP and to fight unemployment. This is an important result, so that we want to confirm this result by computing the income multiplier. The income multiplier of an expansionary fiscal policy in a fixed exchange rate system is that indeed larger than 0. So in the solution vector, we are assuming that all variables are constant except government spending. Government spending increases so that DG is positive. We are inserting the information from the solution vector into the first position of the coefficient matrix because of the fact that GDP is located on the first position of the two unknowns. We compute the multiplier in the following way, that we compute the determinant of the changed coefficient matrix and we divide by the determinant of the unchanged coefficient matrix. So we are computing the elements on the main diagonal, dg times minus 1, and we subtract the product of the side diagonal, minus 0 times 0. Same in the denominator, so 1 minus c1 plus nx1 times minus 1 minus d1 times 0. There are also some 0 signs here. So these expressions will not pop up anymore. There's a minus 1 here and a minus 1 there. These minus 1s will cancel out. When we put dg on the other hand side of the equation, we get dy over dg is equal to 1 over 1 minus c1 plus nx1. This is larger than 0. And it is the case that an expansionary fiscal policy can be used to fight a recession so that the economy is getting out of recession. And this has not only a positive effect on GDP, but the government is also able to fight against a very high unemployment rate. What are the effects on the other endogenous variable? What are the effects of an increase in government spending on the foreign component of money supply? This, of course, should be positive. We have seen that in the graph before, that an increase in government spending leads to a central bank intervening at the foreign exchange market so that in the end, the reserve component increases. So let's do our computations. We have inserted the solution vector on the second position of the coefficient matrix, and now we have to compute the determinant 1 minus C1 plus nx1 times 0 minus d1 dg and then 1 minus C1 plus nx1 times minus 1 minus d1 times 0. Also here there are some zero signs, like here is a 0 and there is a 0, so that some terms drop out. There is a minus 1 in the denominator and a minus d1 in the numerator. So these minus signs here will cancel out. When we put the dg on the other hand side of the equation, we get df over dg is equal to d1 over 1 minus c1 plus nx1, and this expression is larger than 0. So the central bank has to buy foreign currency and accumulates foreign reserves. The foreign component of money supply increases, and hence domestic currency in circulation increases, money supply increases. So let's conclude with respect to the expansionary fiscal policy in the ISZZ LMZZ model. In a fixed exchange rate system, an expansionary fiscal policy is very effective in influencing the GDP level. It does not lead to an increase of the domestic interest rate, so that there is no interest rate induced crowding out effect on investment. So the domestic interest rate is still constant. We know that from equation 3, R is equal to R star. The foreign interest rate has not changed, and therefore also the domestic interest rate has not changed. No exchange rate induced crowding out effect. Here, in case that you want to memorize this effect, fiscal policy in a fixed exchange rate system works fine with respect to GDP. An expansionary fiscal policy in a fixed exchange rate system can increase GDP, and the way how to memorize it is FIFI. A fiscal policy in a fixed exchange rate system works fine with respect to an increase in GDP. Always remember FIFI, then you are able to remember the effects of an expansionary fiscal policy in a fixed exchange rate system. Thank you very much for watching this video. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.